The crisp autumn wind swept through Willow Creek, a picturesque town known for its colonial architecture and a community that held on to tradition. Victor Darnell remained unimpressed. To him, it was just another dot on the map waiting to be restructured. His business partner, Nathan Carter, however, saw potential in every corner. "This is exactly what we need," Nathan said, stepping out of the car, scanning the bustling town square. "Character, history, something real." Victor sighed, adjusting his watch. "History doesn't pay the bills, Nathan." The town's fate hinged on an old manor by the lake, a historic estate on the verge of being sold. Nathan envisioned a sustainable resort, a blend of preservation and innovation. Victor, ever the skeptic, saw nothing but wasted investment. "The infrastructure is too outdated for a modern project," he argued, flipping through financial reports. Nathan smirked. "That's why it needs vision. Do you have it or not?" Victor remained silent, gazing at the manor in the distance like a predator assessing its prey. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Small clusters of townspeople whispered among themselves, casting wary glances their way. Clara Moreau, seated outside her bookstore, watched them carefully. This town was her home, and she wasn't about to let outsiders dictate its future. "Do you know who they are?" asked her older sister, Sophie. Clara kept her gaze fixed on the men. "Investors. Or pillagers, depending on how you look at it." Sophie chuckled, but Clara's expression remained serious. That evening, Nathan insisted they visit a local cafe. Victor, reluctant but unwilling to argue, followed. The moment they stepped inside, a heavy silence fell over the room. People observed them with curiosity and skepticism. The cafe's owner, an elderly man with silver hair, greeted them without enthusiasm. "You're the ones looking to take over the manor." Nathan nodded with a friendly smile. Victor, ever the pragmatist, remained cold. "We want to give this place real purpose." The words lingered in the air like an approaching storm. As night fell over Willow Creek, the community hall filled with people for a charity event. Clara, accustomed to navigating the crowd, immediately noticed the outsiders. Nathan was effortlessly charming, engaging in conversation with several locals. Victor, however, stood in a corner, his glass barely touched, his gaze disinterested. "And that one," Sophie whispered, subtly nodding toward Victor. "Arrogant," Clara responded without hesitation. Before Sophie could reply, Nathan approached with his usual bright smile. "Clara Moreau, right?" "Nathan Carter." He extended his hand, and she shook it firmly. "I hear you're one of the town's most outspoken voices." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Depends. Some voices need to be heard. Others, ignored." Nathan chuckled. "Well, I hope mine is the first kind." But before Clara could reply, she felt someone watching her. She turned and met the piercing gaze of Victor Darnell. He seemed uninterested in the conversation, but his presence was impossible to ignore. Victor decided to interject. "So, you're the town's resistance?" he asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. Clara crossed her arms, standing her ground. "And you?" "The rootless visionary." A charged silence formed between them, tension almost tangible. Roots are just dead weight when you want to grow, Victor said coolly. Clara smirked. Funny. Some people call that stability, Nathan observed, amused by the verbal duel. The exchange lasted only seconds, but its impact was immediate. As Victor walked away without another word, Clara felt an unexpected unease. He was exactly the kind of man she despised. Cold, calculating, driven only by numbers. And yet, something about their brief encounter unsettled her in a way she wasn't ready to admit. The next morning, Clara was sorting book orders at her store when the doorbell chimed. Julian Everett, a local architect and longtime friend, entered carrying a stack of documents. "I hear the sharks have arrived," he said, tossing the papers onto the counter. Clara sighed. "And they're hungry." Julian smirked. "Well, I've got something that might interest you." He spread out blueprints and historical records of the manor. "They don't just want to restore it. They want to change everything," Julian explained, pointing at sketches showing a sleek, modern structure. Clara studied the images, anger bubbling inside her. "This isn't preservation. It's destruction with a pretty label." Julian nodded. "And guess who has a history of doing exactly that?" He pulled out another file and pointed to Victor Darnell's name. The documents detailed an incident years ago where Victor had been involved in acquiring a historical building, only for it to be demolished to make way for a commercial center. "He's the kind of man who only sees value in numbers," Julian said. Clara slammed the file shut. "Then we have to stop him." Julian grinned. "I have a few ideas about that." As they talked, Clara's suspicions about Victor solidified. Julian wasn't just an architect. He was an ally in the fight to protect Willow Creek. And if Victor Darnell thought he could simply steamroll his way through town, he was about to learn that not everything could be bought. In the days that followed, Willow Creek became a silent battlefield. Victor and Nathan's projects sparked heated debates. Small business owners saw an opportunity for growth, while longtime residents feared losing the town's essence. Clara spearheaded the movement against the development, while Nathan tried to mediate. Victor, however, had no interest in winning hearts, just in making his plans work. "This is inevitable," Victor said during a heated town hall meeting. "You can fight all you want, but modernization happens with or without you." Clara, sitting at the opposite end of the table, clenched her fists. "And that arrogance is exactly what destroys communities. You see a town. We see a home." Nathan sighed, realizing that convincing Clara would be harder than expected. The tension escalated beyond meetings. Posters appeared across town reading, "Willow Creek is not for sale," while others saw change as necessary. Victor remained unbothered by the resistance. He focused on refining his plans, adjusting numbers, and strategizing. To him, the outcome was predictable. Or so he thought. That evening, leaving his temporary office, Victor stood on the empty street, gazing at the quiet town. For the first time he wondered, what if he was wrong? But he quickly dismissed the thought. Sentimentality had no place in business. The town hall was packed for the latest meeting on the development plans. Victor presented statistics, graphs, and projections. Clara, unimpressed, leaned back in her chair. "What you fail to understand, Mr. Darnell, is that not everything can be reduced to numbers. He raised an eyebrow. And what you fail to understand, Miss Moreau, is that emotions don't build cities. A murmur rippled through the room. Their confrontation had become more than just a debate. It was personal. You think you're bringing something new, but you're just replacing what already exists, Clara countered. Victor leaned forward slightly. Maybe because what exists is outdated. The silence that followed was deafening. Nathan intervened before the argument escalated further. But one thing was certain. Clara and Victor were nowhere near an agreement, and dangerously close to an inevitable collision. Nathan had always been the one with an eye for charm, but even he was surprised when Victor suggested they take a walk through the town's historic district. "Didn't think you had an interest in old bricks," Nathan teased. Victor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched a group of kids chasing a stray dog near the fountain, their laughter echoing through the narrow streets. "I just want to see what exactly they're so desperate to protect," he finally said. As they walked past the Silver Oak Cafe, Victor noticed the owner, Harold Whitmore, arguing with a bank representative at the entrance. His curiosity piqued. "That place isn't going to last much longer," Nathan commented. "Harold's been struggling for years, but he's too proud to ask for help." Victor took mental notes. "Pride is a liability in business." Nathan smirked. "Or a virtue, depending on who you ask." Later that evening, Victor found himself standing outside the cafe again. He didn't enter, but he watched. The place was a relic, worn but alive, much like the town itself. He made a call. "I want to know exactly how much debt the owner of Silver Oak is in," he instructed his assistant. Discreetly. The next morning, Harold received an anonymous financial reprieve from the bank, one that ensured he could keep his business running. Clara overheard the news at the farmer's market and was immediately suspicious. "Who would just pay off a man's debts like that?" she asked Sophie. "A decent person, maybe," Sophie suggested. Clara frowned. "Or someone trying to buy goodwill." But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. Days later, Clara found herself in the town's archives, flipping through old newspaper clippings and real estate records. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Confirmation of her suspicions, perhaps. But what she found was something else entirely. Victor had, in fact, been involved in redevelopment projects before, but unlike Julian's claims, several of them had successfully integrated preservation with modernization. Her heart pounded as she read testimonials from former community members in other towns. Some projects had faced initial backlash, much like here, but had ultimately flourished. "That can't be right," she muttered, scanning another document. There were no forced demolitions, no disregard for heritage. In fact, in one case, Victor had personally intervened to save a historical landmark from being torn down. Conflicted, she left the archives and walked aimlessly until she reached the lake. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the water. And there, standing near the dock, was Victor himself. She considered walking away, but something made her hesitate. "You always look like you're planning something," she said instead. Victor turned, mildly surprised but amused. Occupational hazard. For the first time, there was no hostility between them. Clara studied him, wondering if she had been too quick to judge. "You don't just destroy things, do you?" she said softly. Victor's expression didn't change, but his voice was quieter than usual. Contrary to popular belief, not everything I touch turns to ruin. It wasn't an apology, nor was it a plea for understanding. It was simply the truth. Julian had always known how to control a narrative. He thrived on his image as the town's protector, the voice of reason against corporate greed. But Clara, now armed with new information, started seeing the inconsistencies in his stories. One evening, as she passed by the town's registry office, she noticed a clerk nervously closing a drawer full of financial reports. Julian's financial reports. Her instincts told her to dig deeper. The next day, she confronted the clerk. "Whatever it is you're hiding, it's not going to stay buried for long." The clerk hesitated but eventually handed over a folder. Inside, Clara found proof that Julian had been misallocating town funds meant for preservation projects. "He wasn't protecting Willow Creek," she murmured, her fingers gripping the paper tightly. "He was using it." That night, she met Julian outside his office. "How long did you think you could keep this quiet?" she demanded. Julian's smirk faltered. "Clara, you don't understand," she cut him off. "I understand perfectly. You fed me lies because you knew I'd be the loudest voice against Victor. You played me." Julian exhaled, his confident facade slipping. "I did what was necessary to keep control." Clara shook her head, feeling anger and shame mix within her. "You made me fight the wrong enemy," she whispered. Then, without another word, she walked away, leaving Julian alone in the dark. The storm came without warning. Heavy rain lashed against the streets, and by morning, parts of the historic district were flooded. Several shops suffered damage, including the community center, which had housed artifacts and records dating back over a century. The town was in shock. "We don't have the resources to repair this quickly," the mayor admitted. Clara felt a sinking dread. This was exactly the kind of vulnerability that led to irreversible change. By midday, however, a fleet of trucks and construction workers arrived. Victor stepped out of one of them, clipboard in hand, already giving orders. "We'll start with the community center. The foundation needs reinforcement before anything else." The mayor blinked. "You arranged this." Victor simply nodded. "You don't need modernization. You need restoration." Clara stood by, watching him coordinate with an efficiency that spoke of experience, not just authority. For the first time, she saw him not as an enemy, but as someone who acted without seeking recognition. While others debated, he solved problems. And despite herself, she felt an unfamiliar sense of admiration. That evening, as she helped distribute supplies, Nathan approached her with a knowing smile. "I think you're starting to see what I saw all along." Clara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched Victor from a distance, his sleeves rolled up, working alongside the locals. Maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about him. A week later, the town was finally recovering. The repairs had strengthened the community's trust in Victor, and while some remained wary, the opposition had noticeably quieted. One evening, Clara found herself walking toward Victor's temporary office, her heart pounding for reasons she didn't fully understand. She found him sitting by the large window, a glass of whiskey in hand. "Didn't think I'd see you here," he said, watching her reflection in the glass. "Didn't think I'd want to be here," she admitted, sitting across from him. For a moment neither spoke. The silence was charged, but not with hostility. This time it was understanding. "You could have walked away," she finally said. "You had nothing to gain from staying here after everything." Victor exhaled slowly. "Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself." He set his glass down, meeting her gaze directly. "Or maybe I just wanted to prove something to you." Clara felt her breath hitch. She had spent so long believing he was the villain in this story. But now, sitting here with him, she realized something unsettling. She didn't want him to leave. Nathan had always been a man of impulse, but when it came to Sophie, everything felt different. Measured, intentional. The weeks spent in Willow Creek had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. That morning, as he stood in front of the bookstore where Sophie worked, he felt something he rarely did: nervousness. "Are you going to stand there all day? Or do you actually need a book?" Sophie teased, leaning against the doorframe. He smirked but didn't move. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Sophie's playful expression faltered, her eyes widening. "Nathan," she whispered. He opened it, revealing a simple but elegant ring. "I never planned to stay," he admitted. "But then I met you. And suddenly, leaving feels like the worst idea in the world." Sophie exhaled shakily, glancing at the ring and then back at him. "You're really doing this?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Nathan nodded. "I don't know what my life looks like without you in it, and I don't want to find out." A long silence stretched between them before she let out a soft laugh, wiping a tear from her cheek. "You're ridiculous," she murmured before slipping the ring onto her finger. And yes, from across the street, Clara watched the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. Nathan had always been the optimistic one, the dreamer. And somehow, he had found exactly what he was looking for. She turned away before Victor could catch her staring, though she knew he had seen it too. After weeks of back-and-forth resistance and unexpected realizations, Victor sat in his office, staring at the blueprints spread across his desk. The original project, the one that had caused so much uproar, suddenly felt wrong. Too intrusive. Too dismissive of the town's identity. He ran a hand through his hair and exhaled. Needed to change. When Nathan walked in, he found Victor in deep concentration, redrafting entire sections. "I'll be damned," he said, leaning over the desk. "You're actually doing it." Victor didn't look up. "If this is going to work, it has to work for them too," he muttered, marking an area for preservation. No massive changes to the main structure. No modern glass extensions. Just restoration and careful repurposing. Nathan grinned, crossing his arms. "You know, a few months ago, you would have bulldozed half this town without blinking." Victor let out a short chuckle. "A few months ago, I wasn't planning to stay." His voice was quieter than before. Nathan tilted his head. "And now?" Victor finally looked up, meeting his friend's gaze. "Now I'm not so sure." Later that evening, Clara received a message. "Meet me at the lake." She hesitated before heading out. When she arrived, Victor was waiting, holding a rolled-up document. "I changed the plans," he said simply, handing it to her. As she unrolled it, her breath caught. The manor was intact. The lake remained untouched. The town's history was preserved. For the first time, Victor Darnell wasn't asking her to trust him. He was showing her why she should. The tension between them had shifted. It was no longer about battles or business. It was something neither of them had been willing to name, until now. They stood by the lake, the document still in Clara's hands, though she wasn't reading it anymore. Her eyes were on him. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why change everything?" Victor exhaled, hands in his pockets. "Because you were right." The admission hung in the air between them. Clara arched an eyebrow, skeptical. "You don't strike me as the kind of man who admits that easily." He let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "I don't. But I also don't ignore the truth when it's staring me in the face." She studied him for a long moment. "And what truth is that?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Victor stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "That I don't just want this project to succeed. I want to be here. With you." The words hit her harder than she expected. He had spent so long being the enemy in her mind that she hadn't considered the possibility that he could be something else. Someone else. For the first time, Clara didn't push him away. Instead, she let herself consider what it would mean to let him in. She exhaled, a small smile forming. "You really are full of surprises, Victor Darnell." He smirked, leaning in just slightly. "Then let me give you one more." And then he kissed her. A moment suspended in time, a collision of everything they had fought against, and everything they had unknowingly been fighting for. The next morning, Clara sat at the bookstore, staring out the window, lost in thought. Everything had changed. The man she once saw as a threat had become something infinitely more complicated. And now she had a choice to make. Stay in the past or move forward. Sophie entered, still giddy from her engagement. "So, are we going to talk about the fact that you kissed Victor Darnell?" Clara shot her a look, but Sophie just grinned. "Oh, come on. Half the town saw you two staring at each other like the world was ending." Clara sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not that simple." Sophie tilted her head. "Isn't it?" Hours later, Clara found herself standing outside Victor's office. Before she could second-guess herself, she stepped inside. He looked up from his desk, clearly surprised. "I thought you were still deciding whether to push me into the lake or not," he teased. Clara crossed her arms. "I was." She hesitated, then exhaled. "But I don't want you to leave." Victor leaned back in his chair, a slow smile forming. "Good. Because I wasn't planning to." Months later, Willow Creek's grand restoration project officially began. The manor remained the town's centerpiece, not as a luxury resort, but as a heritage in blending modern comfort with history. Businesses thrived, and the town evolved without losing its essence. At the wedding of Nathan and Sophie, the entire town gathered to celebrate. Clara stood near the dance floor, watching as Nathan spun Sophie around, pure joy on their faces. "You know," Victor's voice came from beside her, "if I didn't know better, I'd say you actually like it here." Clara smirked, glancing at him. "And if I didn't know better, I'd say you actually belong here." Victor took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Then it's a good thing neither of us are as stubborn as we used to be." Clara laughed. "Speak for yourself." As the music played, they danced. Not as rivals, not as adversaries, but as two people who had finally found their place.